Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am very happy and proud to welcome Catherine Drinker Bowen to the Library of Congress. Mrs. Bowen is now serving her second term as one of our honorary consultants in American Letters. Just last month in New York, she graciously accepted my invitation to be the guest speaker at a convocation of the library's consultants. I feel especially privileged to be in the position of introducing her twice within about a month. She was born in Haverford, Pennsylvania. She spent her childhood in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, where her father was president of Lehigh University, and later went to boarding school in Maryland. An interest in music led her to study at the Peabody Conservatory of Music in Baltimore and at the Institute of Musical Art in New York City. Following the publication in 1924 of The Story of the Oak Tree and a History of Lehigh University, she published a novel entitled Rufus Starbuck's Wife. Friends and Fiddlers, published in 1935, was an impressive combination of her passion for music and her gift for writing, which was later elaborated in her book on Tchaikovsky, Beloved Friend, written with Barbara von Meck, and in Free Artist, The Story of Anton and Nicholas Rubinstein. Her subsequent books have been Yankee from Olympus, Justice Holmes and His Family, John Adams and the American Revolution, The Writing of Biography, The Lion and the Throne, Adventures of a Biographer, Francis Bacon, The Temper of a Man, and most recently, as no doubt most of you know, Miracle of Philadelphia, the story of the Constitutional Convention. 5 of her books, including the latest one, have been Book of the Month Club selections. The Lion and the Throne earned Mrs. Bowen the Henry M. Phillips Prize of the American Philosophical Society, the Anthony M. Literary Award, and the National Book Award. Widely read, her books are distinguished contributions to our understanding of the character of our heritage. Ladies and gentlemen, Catherine Drinker Bowen, who will speak to us on the writing of biography. Mrs. Bowen.
Thank you, Dr. Mumford. Well, I think the people at the Library of Congress surely do their homework. I didn't think anybody remembered that old novel. And ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My subject tonight is a large one: biography, history, and the writing of books. Reading one day in those agreeable volumes entitled Select Essays in Anglo-American History, I came to the editor's preface of Volume 3. The preface opens with an unidentified quotation. "How shall we prologize," it says. "How shall we perorate, say fit things upon art and history?" I could begin by stating that I am abashed to be following as lecturer Professor Alan Nevins, who spoke last week. Actually, I cannot think of anyone in whose footsteps I would rather follow, in whose wake I would rather ride. Now there is a historian. Mr. Nevins' book, The American States During and After the Revolution, never left my desk while I was writing my latest book about the Federal Convention of 1787. In this Coolidge auditorium, it's a little difficult for me to feel anything but at home. I lived in Washington during the year 1944 to 45, and I assure you I never missed one of the magnificent string quartet concerts given here. Also, I passed much time above and below stairs trying to decide what book to write next. Yankee from Olympus had just been published about Justice Holmes, and for a year I had been idle, accepting activities like proofreading and the rechecking of quotations. For a brief time after mailing my manuscript, there had been the customary euphoric period, beautifully described by Mr. Ellery Sedgwick, my publisher, then editor of the Atlantic Monthly, in a letter to me written on receipt of my manuscript. "How wonderful it must feel," he said, "to rest from your labors. That was the only reward of the saints which ever appealed to me. It seems there was a quiet interlude between martyrdom and harp playing, and that's just the condition you're in at this moment." But the period between martyrdom and harp playing, unfortunately, does not last long. Writers are restless between books. The artist is a feverish creature. Only composition will bring down the mercury in his glass. So I hunted the Library of Congress for a subject. Dr. Harold Spivak, my good friend, chief of the music division, at the time had on display a superb exhibition of Paganini memorabilia. I looked at the caricatures, I read letters and contemporary documents, wondering if I should go back to writing about musicians. I had published 3 such books. And here was Paganini, Il Demonio, with his wild black hair, his bony satanic face and figure, his incredible virtuosity on the violin, his tricks, his theatricality, and his true musicianship. It was tempting, and Dr. Spivak is a persuasive man. "The material is right in front of you," he said. "No trains to take, no mailing of books back and forth. Just sit down and write." But then along came John Adams, plain, stout, early balding John Adams, hailing from the town of Braintree, Massachusetts, on the old Plymouth Road. Here was another brand of demonism altogether. Here in letters and diaries was wit and passion and humor and the rare quality of true patriotism. Here, in short, was the best letter writer of American history. And when I testify that that statement came from Professor Julian Boyd of Princeton, you can see it is impressive. It could not have been easy for the editor of the Jefferson Papers to hand the palm to an Adams. It was wartime when I began reading in this library for a biography of John Adams. Librarians were scarce, stack boys were scarcer. I was permitted, therefore, to wander by myself in forbidden places. For days I sat on the floor in the stacks, reading and making notes. Moreover, I was privileged to take out a great many books at a time. Perhaps it saved precious checking out librarial minutes. Working in this great library at the first makes one uneasy, like working in the British Museum, because it is so huge. I remember writing home from London that to enter the British Museum was like being admitted to hell. "One feels suddenly hopeless," I wrote, "as if entering a haystack a mile high to search for a strawberry." Only a new reader knows how much a kind word from an attendant can brighten the morning. If I were king for a day of the Library of Congress, which God forbid, I'd instruct every member of my staff to smile, however briefly and insincerely, at all would-be readers. The New Yorker magazine some months ago carried a true story, which to me was the epitome of correct librarial behavior. The story was in a letter written by an American who had been reading in the British Museum, in the North Wing, where the reading desks are double, 2 inkwells, 2 pens, 2 blotters, 2 chairs. A woman, one of those eccentrics who seem to inhabit public libraries, on this particular morning occupied a desk. She had draped her belongings over the other desk. The librarian approached and asked her to clear the second desk. "The North Wing is busy today," he said, "and these desks are for 2 people. The woman looked up at him. "But I am 2 people," she said. "In that case, madam," the librarian replied, "in that case, will you kindly decide which of the 2 is reading in the North Wing today?" I might add that I remember how outraged I felt the first time I was told, when I handed in my book slip, that a senator had the volume. here in the Library of Congress. I inquired frostily if the senator could be notified. I thought of the way they notify delinquent professors in college libraries when books are kept too long. I don't recall the librarian's reply, but I know that it was facetious and that it included the information that this is, after all, the Library of Congress. By what criterion does the biographer proceed, move from subject to subject, from book to book? What is it impels him to the long search, which for me at least means 3 to 6 years on one biography? The great curiosity impels us. That is a historian's phrase. I've forgotten whose. One could experience the great curiosity about economics, perhaps, or military campaigns, theories of revolution, or the development and history of cybernetics. But biographers, like novelists, center their curiosity upon people. The novelist, I take it, finds his subject somewhere in daily life. His book is conceived from original experience, whereas the biographer finds his subject in books and manuscripts. He is a natural-born reader who lives surrounded by bound volumes and draws therefrom his sustenance. Print is his habitat. He swims in it like a fish in a river. This is not to say the biographer's talent is derivative, less original or creative than the novelist's. I am suspicious of that word, creative. The purpose of art is to suggest life, reproduce it in fresh visions. Filtered through the bloodlines of the artist, experience takes on a meaning that can be communicated. And the process is as important and as difficult whether the reproduction is inspired by the immediate present or by the remote past. In April of 1965, the Library of Congress held a symposium, a conference attended by about 60 editors of the so-called little magazines, many of whom were writers and teachers of contemporary literature. Mr. Reed Whittemore, then our poetry consultant, presided. Carl Shapiro was present, once editor of Poetry magazine. He characterized himself as a sort of nonviolent extremist. Jules Charvetsky was there, Henry Rago of Poetry magazine, Theodore Weiss, editor of the Quarterly Review of Literature, William Phillips, editor of the Partisan Review. It was a company which, on the face of it, signified rebellion, a break with the literary establishment. One panelist remarked somewhat ruefully, "We talk about literature in the past and literature in the present as though there is a kind of stone wall between them." And he asked, why? Mr. Weiss spoke of the students he teaches and their furious trampling upon the past. They don't realize, he said, that if they cut themselves off completely from the past, they too will be old hat in a day or two. They are, in other words, grooming their assassins. In this symposium, Mr. Peter Cause represented the Carnegie Corporation, which had paid for the conference and for the publication of its proceedings. His could have been a difficult role. Daniel among the lions found himself in no more precarious position than today's financial patron in a company of artists. But Peter Cause was wonderful, at the same time worldly, imaginative, and sympathetic. He too spoke of the rebellion of writing youth today, and he dignified the movement by calling it a revolution. But for whose sake, he asked, is this revolution? For the sake of society at large, or for the sake of the revolutionaries themselves? The danger is in mistaking private satisfaction for the public good. I thought of the long-haired youth quoted in a newspaper. The youth stood on a street corner. A middle-aged man passing stared at him. "You don't like it," the youth said jubilantly. "You hate it. Makes you sick to look at it? Good. That's just what we want." Novelists today, it seems to me, sometimes build themselves a trap, a prison, in their insistence upon contemporaneousness, their total concern with the passing moment and the people who inhabit it. I heard a brilliant author in his early 30s declare that it would be of no use to write a novel around a subject or idea that had been done before. The novelist, he said, must therefore be familiar with literature as the physician knows the latest disease and its remedy. And if the novelist's interpretation and prophecy is to have vitality, significance, he must always be one step ahead. To the historian or biographer, such talk is a foreign language. It is Sanskrit, hieroglyph. Biography, like history, is a matter of accretion. Its architecture grows from given materials. A celebrated scholar, head of a great research library, told me that the time to begin study for a new biography of, say, Thomas Jefferson is the morning after the latest Jefferson biography has appeared. I am not sure I agree, yet I often ask myself, what is the historian's part, the biographer's part, in these literary rebellions, these changing fashions of literary philosophies? Is the past to be wiped out, and are biographers then to be robbed of their profession? I think not. Every revolution, literary or political, repudiates the past and then turns back to it, at first with brash dishonesty, using history as falsified national propaganda. Later still, when the national health is restored, scholars are permitted a return to their source documents. In the year 1937, I happened to be in Russia, preparing to write the biography of a 19th century Russian musician. Before leaving New York, I had hired on paper an in-tourist guide to lead me to libraries and certain out-of-the-way museums and such haunts and houses of my biographical characters as were still standing. On arrival, I met my guide, whose name was Emily. She was a young graduate of the Moscow University, and she knew nothing, altogether nothing, of the history of her country before the date of October 1917. For 10 weeks, Emily struggled with me, inquiring of all tourists she had guided why I alone wished to see not the present glorious accomplishments of the Soviet Union, but shabby tumble-down squares and houses, the defaced imperial eagles over the doors of one-time princely palaces, the old music conservatory library, the old dog market and cemetery. Finally, she capitulated, out of exhaustion, I think, and instead of leading me through marble subway stations and ball-bearing factories and shiny new syphilis clinics, she took me where I wished to go. It was in the Leningrad cemetery that Emily justified herself, stopped to look me full in the eye. After all, she said, Stalin says we must study the past in order to understand the present. Oh, I said, does he indeed? What an original doctrine. To be modern, to feel and relish one's own times, is for the writer not only exciting and splendid, it is a necessity. But to be trapped by one's modernity is not so splendid. It can bring on myopia and fog. And there is still another phase or fashion which the modern novelist and playwright is experiencing. Biographers caught this particular contagion some years ago, but outgrew it. With us, it was called the debunking period, when we were moved to ridicule the image, break it down, a healthy reaction perhaps from the laudatory, family-inspired type of 19th century biography. Debunking is an old word now, outmoded. The current form and philosophy carries grander names like realism or even truth. And in certain circles, there is a demand, not an invitation, but a demand that we accept it. Man is vile, we are told. Life is absurd, cruel, haphazard. Yet one asks oneself, is this indeed so new? Or is it a point of view not unfamiliar to writers who, centuries ago, told us how Oedipus, all unwitting, met his father on the road to Thebes and suffered that little happening known as parricide? Biographers, unlike novelists and playwrights, are no longer required to hate and ridicule their subjects. Maurois plainly admired his tempestuous Balzac. Leon Adele likes Henry James. David Cecil treats Lord Melbourne, young and old, with affectionate, bantering respect. It would almost seem that Renan, the historian, was justified when he said, one should write only about that which one loves. And indeed, it would be difficult to spend 5 or 6 biographical years with a man one despised. Yet sooner or later, a biography will be published that is as deliberately savage as Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. I'm a little surprised that no biographer has attempted it, though Truman Capote's book was an approach. I shall be curious to see how this new biographer proceeds, what subject he chooses, and if he treats his hero with thorough contempt, or in the Dostoevskian sense of the criminal as halfway between saint and sinner. I confess that when I began to study for my Life of Sir Francis Bacon, I planned a book after the modern manner, not a debunking, but as it were, an unmasking. To me, it seemed indeed a philosophical absurdity that a mind of such brilliance and confessed worldly ambition should let itself be betrayed at the end by a grandiose, arrogant carelessness concerning that cherished tool of the establishment, money. Lord Chancellor Bacon, you will remember, was charged by Parliament with taking bribes in office, and in his 61st year impeached, convicted, and stripped of all his worldly glory. Preparing to write this life, I spent much time in the library at the Pennsylvania Psychiatric Institute reading about money, its original meaning, its symbolism throughout the ages. A murky, mucky subject, not at all respectable in its terminology. What money means to men who dream of it in their sleep, what finding it means and losing it. Ladies and gentlemen, I can only say that after a week's reading, the young librarian at the Institute told me severely she hoped when I finished with these books that I would put the subject away from me and forget it forever. In the end, the Lord Chancellor himself took charge, and through his own writings swung my biographical compass to its true north. The breadth of Bacon's genius, the total persuasion of his prose style, swept the word absurdity out of the picture. One should write only about that which one loves. The words love, despise, these of course imply the making of value judgments, today a proscribed activity surely. If we are cool, if we are with it, we will not make value judgments. Ladies and gentlemen, permit me the value judgment of saying what nonsense. If biographers and the writers of novels find it more subtle to present the facts and let readers make their own value judgments, fine. But doesn't it come to the same thing in the end? The biographer shows his bias, his value judgments, as well by what he leaves out of his book as by what he puts in. The writer of any book, play, poem, begins with a point of view. Even the scientist has a starting point, though he may find what he is looking for quite by the way, by happy accident. Charles Darwin remarked, "How odd it is that anyone should not see that all observation must be for or against some view if it is to be of any service." The writer is possessed, he hath a devil. If he hasn't, he should not be writing. This devil rides his back like an incubus. The writer is savage with the burden of it. The writer, in short, has experienced recognition. He has had a vision which he is impelled to share. This applies as well to the biographer as to the playwright or poet. Whether the biographer's readers will share his vision depends not alone on the writer's sincerity of soul, but on his craftsmanship, beginning with the ability to collect and sort large masses of historical material. In a long work, the arranging of one's files, of those thousands of notes, is a practical discipline, not to mention the arranging of one's time, the canny, stubborn allocation of hours, day and night, yet that too must be sparked from within. To sit in a great library, copying other people's words, to crouch before one's file cabinet, arranging these words on 5 by 8 inch cards, can be a deadening exercise unless there is light behind it, and the light must hold. George Bancroft wrote in 9 volumes the first comprehensive history of the United States. Bancroft's father, a congregational minister, used to conduct family prayers every morning, circa 1812, for his 13 children and their mother. The Reverend Mr. Bancroft, gazing upon his little flock, used to pray, "Lord, give us a teachable temper." The biographer very much needs a teachable temper, but he needs also imagination to explore the how and why of the facts that he memorizes. He must be capable of sympathy with man's weakness, with man's terrible tendency to betray the thing he loves. Sin and suffering must not be strangers to the biographer, who needs also the simplicity to rejoice over man's courage, over his amazing capacity for lightheartedness in the face of a threatening universe. I have spoken of traps into which writers can fall. First, a fashionable rebellion against the past, which strips the artist of a wealth of material. Second, a fashionable conviction that man and life are cruel and haphazard, and that only by depicting him as vicious can man be understood. In an article entitled "The Abdication of the Artist," Paul Horgan has traced the history of some of these trends and fashions. I strongly recommend his article, which can be found in the Proceedings of the American Philosophical Society for October 1965. I often think how fortunate I am to be a biographer. History and biography outside of the schools are neither enslaved nor betrayed by fashions in form or philosophy. Oh, there are isms, and we hear of them, they throw their shadow. In an academic quarterly, I read the review of a book on historiography. It mentioned functional history, relational history, relativistic history, instrumentalist, pragmatic, and presentist history. I looked up some of these words. They were not in the dictionary. That happened in 1958. No doubt 6 or 7 more such adjectives have by now been invented to bemuse the student in the graduate schools of history. For writers, it must be truly difficult to live down the deadening effects of the PhD training, though we all know of historians who have lived it down, and gloriously. But these are the happy few, the greatly talented who could live down anything. History, though classified among the humanities, has long been treated in the colleges as a science. Methodology has ruled the classroom. Today, there's a restless stirring in these quarters. Students plead for something beyond the acquirement of skills in evaluating historical evidence. A new humanism is blowing through the campus. There is a revolt against that confusion of history with science which has ruled for a century. The abdicated artist is rebuilding his kingdom, his academic throne. It is the business of the biographer, or so it seems to me, to search out his material and then to tell his story as clearly, as authentically, and as entertainingly as he can. Biographical writing has room for subtlety, but not for obscurity. The biographer must communicate with his readers. If he is a writer of legal history, or so-called legal biography, the writer must tempt his readers to linger over quite dismaying pages, such as the speeches of orators in constitutional conventions, the dissenting or representative opinion of judges from the bench, or lengthy charges made to juries in 16th century state trials. That admirable 19th century historian, Bishop William Stubbs, in the preface to one of his many books, remarks that constitutional history examines the exploits and characters of men in a different light than that shed by the false glare of arms. Constitutional history, says the bishop, holds out small temptation to the mind that requires to be tempted to the study of truth. Ladies and gentlemen, may I say that I, for one, have ever been ready, even eager, to use such biographical temptations and seductions as lie in my power. If in one of my chapters a lawyer makes a speech, it seems pertinent to describe the room in which the speech is to be given, the manner of the orator, and the weather outside, if the evidence warrants it. A speech made with the sun against the windows gives a different effect from one delivered in a raging thunderstorm, such as Patrick Henry's wild declamation in Shockoe Courthouse, Richmond, Virginia, against the ratification of the United States Constitution. Readers like to know where their man is standing when he delivers his speech. They like to know how he looks. History was not made by ghosts. Patrick Henry, when he delivered that thundering oration, was 52 years old and wore a red wig, ill-fitting and loose. A contemporary described Henry's odd gesture of raising a finger and twirling the rig around his head as he spoke. James Madison, known today as the father of the United States Constitution, was only 36 when he played his very large part in the Constitutional Convention of 1787. Madison's voice was so low that men had trouble hearing him, and he had a habit of standing with his hat in his hand and his notes in his hat. By such items, ladies and gentlemen, the biographer tempts reluctant minds to the study of truth. But although the biographer need not be troubled by the dictates of literary fashion, still he should be conscious of these fashions. He must brief himself. He must keep abreast. It is well to know the enemy. So the biographer of 1967 asks himself, what about electric circuitry, the television screen, the computer? Mr. Marshall McLuhan tells us that the visual component in our lives has already been dropped in favor of the visceral, the kinetic, the auditory modes of response. Print as a medium will disappear, says McLuhan, and he envisions the possibility of a world without words, a wordless, intuitive world, like a technological extension of consciousness. The medium is the message, And the Beatles, say McLuhan, have already told us so in their role of anti-environment if we would but listen. Ladies and gentlemen, in this brave new world of integrated and processed knowledge, this quicker, efficient world of computers and systems analyses, what will happen to the writers of history? Will they be helped, hindered, stopped altogether? Granted that science proceeds and progresses through teamwork, science has grown too vast for the individual to cope with. But history and biography lie in the realm of art, and good books are not written in committee. Mr. R. Buckminster Fuller, more eloquent and more truly imaginative than Mr. McLuhan, has defined this theory of the anti-environment. He tells us how, as we emerge from a 19th century environment, for instance, that environment becomes an art form, as Victorian chairs are to us, or to the 19th century Romanticism, which was the anti-environment of industrial and technological expansion. Mr. Fuller reminds us that the contents of Shakespeare's plays are medieval. Shakespeare, he says, looks back squarely and firmly at the receding forms. This is plain enough, surely, though again it hardly seems new. Stalin says we must study the past in order to understand the present. What disturbs the historian is the accent of derision, which seems to accompany these statements of McLuhan, Fuller, and the prophets of electric circuitry, as though looking back were silly, outmoded, and looking forward the only plausible procedure for active minds. These men have a marvelous, extraordinary vocabulary. They can say anything and more than anything. They manipulate words as if every word were a palindrome and could be spelled backward as well as forward. The computer, we already know, can be a marvelous tool for assembling bibliography. Microfilm, photocopy can save us trips to Europe if we desire to be saved. Yet the prophets of electric circuitry, applying their new religion to art or to history, permit themselves a somewhat naive omission. In their pronouncements, one does not meet with the word emotion, that word which signifies the food and sustenance of the novelist, the poet, the biographer. After 4,000 years of recorded history, the basic emotions still motivate us: jealousy, envy, love, fear, greed, lust. We need no anti-environment to tell us that ingratitude remains sharper than the serpent's tooth. Somerset Maugham, in his old age, liked to tell a story about himself. It seems that Maugham's daughter brought her husband with her to the Riviera, with a suggestion that her father's heirs not be required to wait until Maugham's death to receive their inheritance. Lawyers had drawn up a form of trust by which the heirs could have the money now, with ample allowance set out for Maugham's wants. Maugham shook his head. "But why do you refuse?" his daughter asked. "Because," Maugham said, "I have read King Lear." Now, I will have to add that afterwards, Maugham's daughter announced in print that the story was not true. But Maugham said that didn't matter. It was pertinent anyway. It is interesting to speculate about the effect upon our writers of communication, television, processed information, and the computer. Peter Cause, whom I quoted earlier, says that electric circuitry, by separating us from the written word, has indeed had a profound effect upon the quality of prose style, which he declares has gone steadily downward. It is a great deal easier, he says, to tell that something is written with the correct intentions than to tell whether it is well written. And most of what impassioned young authors write is highly relevant to the human condition. But much of it, says Mr. Cause, is bad. It is a truism and a truth to say that good writing comes from good reading. If in future the medium is to be the message, we shall need care and skill in processing our computers, or we shall be impoverished altogether. Charles Darwin, lacking modern machinery, spent 20 years in assembling facts and then processing them laboriously by himself in his own brain, the result being his book, The Origin of Species. In his autobiography, Darwin notes certain effects this activity has had upon him. "My mind," he said, "seems to have become a kind of machine for grinding general laws out of large collections of facts. But why this should have caused the atrophy of that part of the brain alone on which the higher tastes depend, I cannot conceive. A man with a mind more highly organized or better constituted than mine would not, I suppose, have thus suffered. And if I had to live my life again, I would have made a rule to read some poetry and listen to some music at least once every week. For perhaps the part of my brain now atrophied would thus have kept alive through use. The loss of these tastes is a loss of happiness, Darwin finishes, and may possibly be injurious to the intellect and more probably to the moral character by enfeebling the emotional part of our nature. I remarked earlier that it is the biographer's business to search out his material and then tell his story as clearly, authentically, and entertainingly as possible. This simple little receipt implies actually some complex procedures. Sitting down to write, one asks oneself, what is to be the shape of this biography? What is its form? By the shape, the form, the book can stand or fall. Biography, of course, takes many forms. There is the long, rich narrative like Maurois' Balzac, or like H.F.M. Prescott's superb life of Queen Mary Tudor. Miss Prescott was a novelist, an excellent novelist, before she was a biographer. And this, combined with her scholarship, her easy familiarity with 16th century England, makes for a masterly biography filled with color, movement, and emotion, the tragedy of that loneliest, most unloved of queens. There is again the English essay type of biography, like David Cecil's The Young Melbourne, or Georgina Battiscombe's less ambitious, but altogether delightful biography of Mrs. Gladstone. There is the big, splashing, expensive type of book, like Edith Sitwell's The Queens and the Hive, which I, for one, consider a failure. An extraordinarily talented writer slapped her book together, I would like to bet at a publisher's suggestion, very possibly telling herself, oh, after writing poetry, biography will be child's play. One can simply go ahead and drop the words down and leave them where they fall. After quoting, consorting with, and castigating the literary gods, I hesitate to come down and around to the works of C.D. Bowen. But the quickest and perhaps most authentic way of presenting biographical problems is to review one's own problems and pitfalls. My latest book, Miracle at Philadelphia, was slow in revealing to me its form, the shape it was to take, the frame in which I must contain the story. I knew this was to be narrative history. That is, it would tell the story week by week or day by day until the United States Constitution was signed by the convention delegates and sent to the Congress in New York. I knew also that I hoped to have my story open quietly and mount in dramatic interest, mount steadily until that September day when old Dr. Franklin, standing in line to sign the document, remarked that now at last he knew our national sun was not setting but rising. This was, however, group history, something I had hitherto avoided, though not from want of urging. Committee members had called asking me to write the story of the Pennsylvania Hospital, founded by Benjamin Franklin, the story of various state bar associations, the story of the Philadelphia Orchestra. Always I had refused. Institutional history repelled me. It seemed a kind of anti-history, bloodless and dull. My biographies hitherto had centered on a single individual and traced his development. The Federal Convention of 1787, on the other hand, comprised 55 delegates who sat around tables for 4 months and wrote the United States Constitution. This surely was close to institutional history. I had studied the records of the convention. I had gone over carefully the speeches in those 4 big volumes edited by Max Farrand, published in 1937 and entitled Records of the Federal Convention. It was exciting, vivid material, eloquently supplemented by contemporary letters, diaries, autobiographies, newspapers. No period in United States history had been more fully explored. Books on the Federal Convention had been appearing annually, even semi-annually. I bought them and read them. They did not alter my purpose. None came up to the quality of Mark Van Doren's The Great Rehearsal, published in 1948. But that was written around a theme to prove a point, and to me the book had never seemed adequate. Clinton Rossiter's book, incidentally, did not appear until mine was finished. 2 strikes were already on my side. First, the source material was dramatic once it could be weeded out. Second, the convention delegates were men well worth describing. Thomas Jefferson had been only half facetious when he called this convention an assembly of demigods. I had no intention, however, of filling my book with intimate personal descriptions and letting these carry the whole. My book was to have not 55 heroes, but one hero, the United States Constitution. My plot was, quite simply, how the Constitution came into being. Here indeed was a tale teeming with plot and counterplot, ending with the grand federal processions that celebrated adoption of the new Constitution, a surefire climax contrived by history, put into my hand by Clio herself. I saw that I could write my book entirely from printed sources, straight out of the records. The basic scene, the Pennsylvania State House, which we now call Independence Hall, lay within half an hour of my study. I could drive often to Fifth and Chestnut Streets. I could haunt that old brick building. I could walk in the State House yard as the delegates did. So much for plot and physical scene. But I knew from experience that a wrong start, a wrong opening to chapter 1, might deflect this story and ruin it by leading me into byroads of political philosophy or legal lore. With my story buzzing in my head, I sat for 3 infertile months contriving a beginning. Aware that the Federal Convention was not sui generis, but was the culmination of a long historical process, I tried opening in 1692 with a witches' trial at Salem. Next, I began with Benjamin Franklin's Albany Congress in 1754. Union, the union of all the states, was what the Federal Convention tried to achieve, and the Albany Congress had aimed at union. Then I began with General Washington during the war with England, when the general despaired, almost, of America's fighting a war or even existing as a nation without, he wrote, having lodged somewhere a power which will pervade the whole Union in as energetic a manner as the authority of the state governments extends over the several states. Washington had tried to persuade his New Jersey troops to swear allegiance to the Union, and they had refused. New Jersey is our country, they said. In Congress, a New Jersey member denounced the general's action as improper. With each of these tentative beginnings, I rearranged my files and notes accordingly, a manipulation which swallowed hours and days of time. I spread the notes in little heaps and shifted them like cards. I spent a summer at this exercise, erasing the headings on my manila folders and writing in new headings. Nothing happened. The mixture did not gel. These openings were too long, too remote from the Federal Convention. I saw that I was endeavoring to educate my readers, tell them why a federal constitution was necessary to 13 quarreling, jealous states which like to call themselves severally sovereign and independent. With all my books, when in process, I have a folder of notes marked, "What the reader must know." Before whatever date or scene I am ready to write, what the reader must know before the Boston Massacre, before Sir Walter Raleigh's trial in 1600, before the Federal Convention of 1787 met in Philadelphia. What the reader must know before he could be truly involved with the convention was vast and could be laborious reading. I did not wish to lose my audience before the convention so much as opened. Readers are chary of being educated. As a process, it must indeed be done with care. One bright September morning, it came to me there was only one way to begin this book. I would open on May 14th, 1787, with the convention itself, with the Philadelphia heat, so well documented by a delegate from Connecticut. Name the delegates with brief identification, leaving detailed description to the moment when the delegate in question would rise to speak. Don't stop to describe the State House or the East Room where the convention met. Then I told myself, flash back, as the phrase goes, to General Washington's troubles and his poignant appeals to Congress during the war with England, or go back to 1754 and the Albany Congress, or if I wished, to the Salem witches' trial, wherever I chose to go. But keep returning briefly to my permanent stage set, Independence Hall, with the 55 delegates sitting at their tables, state by state, the slatted blinds drawn on the long windows against the summer sun. I tried this, and at once my notes slipped into line. The folders seemed to write their own headings. All was suddenly pertinent and took its place. I had long ago envisioned a digression in the middle of my book, a journey through the states, designed not only as a relief after so much speech-making, but to tell the reader what he must know about the country for which delegates were contriving a constitution. With my permanent stage provided and set, even these diversional chapters dropped into line. I shall not stand here tonight and say the rest was easy, but I was launched, and for the ensuing 3 years I traveled my road, heading for adoption of the Constitution and the city celebrations, heading for Dr. Benjamin Rush's letter describing the Philadelphia procession of July 4th, 1788, glorious and touching. The letter and my book ends with the words, "'Tis done, we have become a nation." Ladies and gentlemen, I have tried tonight to describe some of the problems that beset historians and biographers, both from sources outside themselves and from sources intrinsic to the material with which they have to deal. I have spoken of fashions in literature, fashions in historiography, and finally, I mentioned a few technical difficulties that one writer, this one, has faced. Let me confess that I am hopeful. To the young writer, I can, with a whole heart, recommend the craft of biography as a way of living and of learning about that absurd, illogical, and sometimes noble manifestation called mankind. I thank you.
Thank you, Catherine Drinker-Bowen. After that applause, I need not say more. Thank you again and again.